Scotland is the largest producer of oil and is the second largest producer of gas in Europe. It has more than 80% share of the UK's North Sea assets and holds more fresh, high-quality water in its many lochs and lochans than England and Wales combined. Indeed, one loch, Loch Ness, has more water within it than the whole of England. When Scotland is compared to other smaller nations within the European Union, such as Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Romania and others, it has much more natural resources than those countries, yet it is poorer socially and economically than they are. This is because it is tied to its larger southern neighbour as a colony. This video explains the colonial control and poor administration of Scotland since its political union with England in 1707. Thinking of England as Scotland's colonial overlord will be hard for many to comprehend, as today, in our day-to-day lives, it is a foreign thought to most of us. This slide sets out to rectify that view, or at least make you think. 3 definitions taken from the internet to show the key components of colonial control. Basically, taken by force, political control, and extended political control. The type of control taken depends on the situation. For Australia, there was little to restrict colonisation. For India, it started with trade only, adapting to area control and eventually country control. Whatever the colony, its only purpose is to be economically asset stripped by the coloniser for its own benefit. It does this by various means, for example suppressing the colony's culture over time, such as language and dress, putting its own people in charge of key institutions, relocating its people. Was Scotland taken over by a larger, more economically powerful neighbour? Yes. To explain how, I will proceed through the topics listed in this menu. The subject is complex, and to really understand it you need to read about it in more detail. Indeed, I recommend a book highly that I mention at the very end of this presentation. There are many books on this, but be careful of bias within the story based on the author. Between 1707 and 1746, Scotland was asset stripped, trade died away, and poverty continued. Many people across the whole of Great Britain at the time were angry at the removal of James VII of Scotland, second of England. His removal was because he was a supporter of the Roman Catholic faith. This created discontents among groups who became known as the Jacobites, Jacobus being Latin for James. They hoped to restore the deposed king, who had emigrated to France. They rebelled in the years shown on this slide. Then, after the king died, his son, Charles Edward Stuart, tried to take both countries' crowns in a rebellion started in 1745. They turned back after Derby and were defeated by the English army in 1746. No prisoners were taken. The victorious army then built over 430 cantonments across Scotland. The Stennis Historical Society reviewed extensive records in Edinburgh Castle for the years 1746 to 1756 to get the information for this map. In addition, for the first 4 years after 1746, there was also over 200 commodore's properties used as bases. Following 1746, over 3 years of extreme violence against the people in the Highlands, murder, rape, children killed, all goods like cattle were taken, soldiers ran amok. We have 2 verified records of this genocide. The Episcopal Bishop of Ross and Caithness spent years researching events. His examination was so meticulous that many events recorded via different sources. His 10-volume book, written in Latin, called The Lion in Mourning has been translated to English. John Stewart, a civil servant from Inverness, also wrote a detailed diary. The spelling of his name here was his. These actions by the Jacobites caused England to enforce action which suppressed Scotland's culture, the migration of millions, increased poverty and economic cruelty. This was the start of true colonisation as a deliberate policy by England. The next section looks at the effect of policies of the colonial control to do with mass migration from Scotland and into Scotland from England. Policies by Westminster led over time to a massive change in the population of Scotland. During this time, poor government within Scotland, caused by the loss of its own government, later military rule from England, and a deliberate policy of maintaining lower wages, caused extreme poverty. Also a major factor was the clearances, the forced migration of people from their land. This was a period when half of Scotland's people were removed by the use of the cruel process of clearances and deliberate policy to the Empire via ships provided free or nearly free by the British state. As the Scots left, mainly English immigrants moved in, also a few Irish manual labourers to replace evicted Scots, as well as some Jews who were facing persecution around Europe. Prior to the early 1930s, it was mostly, but not exclusively, single people who migrated. However, in the last century, it changed to whole families. This outflow was not stopped until the very end of the last century. This generally did not happen significantly in England. Little documentation by historians mention that in this period the departing Scots were replaced by mainly English people. These took mainly the management and government roles, took most land ownership, sometimes by force, and in effect split the country ethnically. These are migrants at the time in the late 1800s emigrating from Scotland. Total lack of any significant action between 1707 and 1746 by Westminster led to demoralisation of Scotland. They had lost their constitution, government and pride. A government vacuum at all levels of society then occurred. London stayed remote and let Scots alone until 1746. In the period before 1746 and more so after, whole tracts of Scottish land was taken and the clearances began mainly after 1750. The military suppressed Scottishness as much as possible by murders, beatings, jail and law. Formally from 1851, Westminster formally provided free and token payment only for Scots to travel to the colonies. This was the active removal of Scots. More information soon. The clearances were not just from the 1700s, but extended to the mid-1850s, with still some happening after that. Clearances also occurred in the southern uplands of Scotland, not just the Highlands. Please read this. It was written in 1880 from a magazine existed at the time in Edinburgh. Lower wages were paid in Scotland. This continued until well into the 1970s. Despite having the oldest universities in the UK, higher education was only for the very upper classes. This is how bad wage differentials were in the 1800s. With the destruction of the Scottish economy and this wage situation, it forced many people to leave to the colonies and vacated Scotland. This is what colonisers do. They remove indigenous people. This is what happened. Also, any support for the poor was lower in Scotland than in England. Scotland was marked by terrible inequalities, poor distribution of wealth. Poverty was maintained to migrate people. Hopefully you are getting the message of suppression to manipulate a lower paid labour resource and provide labour to the ever-growing empire. As industrialisation grew in Scotland, this was in effect. As with its other colonies, England created regiments from the local population. In India, this was well known. This was part to suppress rebellion at home, cope with the impossibility for English people to police the vast empire, and also simply as a labour resource. For most of the time from 1707, any Scots were often in the front line of battle to protect the initially high casualties from the top English regiments. This has happened in many battles over the centuries. This was true at the Battle of Quebec, during the Crimean War, the Indian Mutiny, Waterloo, and at the D-Day invasion. Indeed, in Quebec, General Wolfe said while fighting France that he admired the bravery of the Scottish regiments, but he also said this: "Have no mind ere a Highlander falls." By the Victorian era, the loyalty of Scotch regiments was no longer suspect. This allowed the wearing of kilts in all Scottish regiments, and eventually the population at large. As an example, pro rata, in the First World War, Scottish casualties were 40% higher in Scotland than England, because it was the Scotch regiments that often led the attacks. This was true at D-Day. It was the French, the Americans, the Scots, and the Canadians that invaded in the first day. The English regiments only came on day 2. A summary of the Union on Scotland, a labour resource used to benefit the coloniser. This is a fact. Very few Scots held any political, educational control or bodies of the state in Scotland. This is a Scots language view of that situation. A summary of this video section, please read. If the migration levels forced on Scotland had happened in England, then 28 million English people would have been forced out of the country. That tells you what happened pro rata with regards to Scotland. I'm now going to talk about language suppression, which is used by a coloniser to suppress its language. Indeed, later I'll have another top presentation on this. The Scots view. It is well understood that the identity of a nation or a group of people is the understanding of culture, identity, and language. This section is about language suppression. If a language is restricted, as is the case in Scotland, then its ancient culture and understanding of self will change also. Any language, if it goes extinct, is abhorred by academics as a loss in understanding. Therefore, loss of language removal, in our case, changes Scottish culture. Even in my youth, I remember as a child using lots of Scots words like gowk, which is a cuckoo, thrapple, which is your throat, and hauk is to dig, but my life at work in management meant I had to speak proper English. I have made an effort to understand my country, hence these videos. Many don't. You may think this is a bit over the top, but facts bear this out. In Germany, children are taught their own language from parents, society, and school. They in many cases also learn English as one of the main international business languages. We in Scotland could have continued to learn to write and speak Scots with English as a second language. I'm sure this wasn't considered. It wasn't colonial policy. By teaching English, our culture continues to disappear over time, a natural result of colonization. So how was language suppressed? In Scotland there is a perception that we have always run our own education and that it's always been devolved. This is not true. In 1872, an Act in Westminster did the opposite, transferring the running of Scotland's schools and universities to London. This was the start of a policy of replacing Scots and Gaelic and the removal from the curriculum of Scottish history. In Scotland, even today in 2024, we are not taught Scottish history. An attack on the country's culture and language indeed. Up until 1870, all Scottish education was run by the Church of Scotland, teaching Scottish history, Scots and Gaelic as appropriate to the location. The department then managing Scots, they called it Scotch, were Anglophobe, privately educated people, as they were the only people with degrees at the time. Working class oinks were forced to play rugby, a game alien to Scotland, which is a military class-orientated game in England. The history of the Empire replaced Scots history, as indeed did the English language. Scots, in many places, had their mother tongue barred. Since that time, the number of teachers who were Scottish has diminished, such that by the time you come to 2023, 40% of the teachers in most parts of Scotland are from England. The campaign continues. One result of this is that many professions, particularly at that time, were looking down on Scots speakers. Of course, all business communication was in English, diminishing the use of Scots further. I witnessed that myself in my early life. Working in England, I was ridiculed continually because of my Scots accent. Scotland has many universities, 4 of them the oldest in the UK and indeed the world. If you were asked how many of the professors, deans, vice principals or principals level conditions within the institutions that were Scots, what would you say the percentage was? Universities recruit from other UK universities and occasionally overseas. The policy against Scots speakers continues to this day. Many senior Scots in teaching have great difficulty getting to the top post because of their views and their language. You are looked down upon unless you have a clear English accent. Could I suggest clear accents like Essex, Lancashire, Somerset or Birmingham? Only you can find examples of this prejudice in the media if you look. Remember that language and culture are one of the same thing. I'm now going to talk about taking the wealth of a nation. In the case of Scotland, I wish to give you examples of the wealth exploitation. First, though, it is important to understand that the UK myth of one kingdom often comes into play to justify the asset removal. Many Scottish asset exploitations are justified by Crown lands. In Scotland, there has never been Crown lands. There is a Crown but no monarch, and the Scottish Crown Constitution is totally different from the one in England. That is why we have 2 Crown offices. The United Kingdom is 2 kingdoms, 2 constitutions, 2 crowns, but in Scotland's case we have not had a monarch since 1714, so how can Westminster use this myth? The Treaty of Union in 1707 did not give any territory to England, and yet after the military takeover from 1746, Westminster treated Scotland as its territory illegally. Scotland in the United Nations is recorded as a separate state in a political union with England. Assets taken from Scotland should be done with financial recompense to Scots. The assets do not belong to England in law or in treaty. The land resources was plundered first, at the same time as forced migration. This happened as early as the late 1740s. Indeed, in 1754, English people came up, took land near a place called Tyndrum, and started lead mines, taking the land forcibly by the people that owned the lands. All this was recorded in many places by the church at the time. The extraction of resources occurred across the UK, but the difference in Scotland was that the artificially held down wage costs meant that the profits were huge when compared to England. This was exploitation again of the labour resource. In the 1970s, there was a call in Scotland for a parliament. At that time, huge amounts of gas and oil was found in the waters around Scotland. Due to the demand for a parliament at that time, the government commissioned a report from a civil servant named Macrone to consider Scottish opinion. He concluded that we would want independence. The report therefore was hidden for 50 years. Scots' wealth was hidden from us. The wealth was eventually used to fund the de-industrialisation of the United Kingdom. No one knows why this was done. The fact that it was done shows that Westminster understands that England has no rights to Scottish territory. This is against international law. If Westminster considered that it owns Scots territory, why was this done? Holyrood, at the behest of Westminster, is installing green free ports, which are not free nor green, on Scotland's east coast. They are again using the myth of Crown lands, doing so against Scots law. They are creating many business-driven 25-year-long statelets that are out with UK employment and trade laws. These will also destroy Scotland's unique Commonwealth Fund. They will also remove power from the Holyrood Parliament. Scotland has Europe's highest resource of wind and tidal energy. Since 2016, this resource is increasingly being extracted to England. The irony is that current tariff rules make it more expensive for Scots to connect to the grid. In London, the average daily charge is 30 pence. In Scotland, it is 65 pence. Scotland is penalised by geography and politics. The money flows mainly in one direction. This is normal in a colonial state. I'm now going to talk about colonial control today. All nations need institutions. It is the way society is structured and organized. Social institutions are needed to allow a society to fulfill its objectives, be they economic, academic, religious, etc. Nelson Mandela stated after he took over that the institutions in South Africa needed to change in order to serve all of the people, not just the white people. He said it was the removal of oppression. This structure does not therefore reflect very well the Scottish people and their democratic decisions, nor their culture, the Scots language, and to agree Scotland's national identity as perceived by the people. The unelected Anglophobe unionist supporters in this chamber and the elite are a cultural and societal mismatch for many in Scotland. This report here, if you look at it, clearly states what I've said here, that Scots are excluded from jobs even in the universities. That's Scots speakers. Nationalist supporters appear to be discriminated against in British institutions, especially organisations in state defence, security activities, and many public sector jobs. Some of these require a pledged allegiance from the employer to the British nation and in some cases the English monarchy. Those with known political support for independence do not fit the bill. Many examples are known of this within Scotland, but you'll never find it in the media. There has been in the past, and with some ongoing today, to legally suppress voices that are against the British state, and even discriminate with state support against individuals. I'm not going to give examples, but people in Scotland in the independence movements know this. There's one newspaper with a circulation of 20,000 that supports independence. All the other media in Scotland, all of it, don't tell the whole story. They don't report what the 54% of the people in Scotland want. They talk and suppress against them. This is normal for colonialism. The members of the Scottish Parliament are elected via a voting system designed to keep away majorities, thereby stopping nationalist majority rule. It has partially failed on this. The members of Scotland's Parliament and government, including the SNP, follow the rules of Westminster and the English Bill of Rights and ignore the powers of Scots law still live today due to ignorance or done deliberately. Had they used Scots law, Scotland would be independent today. Scotland's Parliament was created with England's Bill of Rights legislation and not Scots law. The elected members in this building abide by English law, and most are ignorant of the powers they have in Scotland. In 2015, at the UK general election, the Scottish National Party won 57 of the 59 constituency seats in Scotland, and over 50% of the votes cast. The colonial representative shown here went to London to represent Scotland in the SNP. Ironically, with Scots law, the claim of right and understanding of the Treaty of Union, they had enough power there in law to get Scotland's independence. This is 2024, with the Labour Party celebrating winning most MPs in Scotland for the Westminster Parliament. They were trumpeting their Scottish majority. They didn't realise that they are colonial administrators. This is a long read, and I apologise for that, but it summarises everything in this presentation so far and shows you the colonial actions that have taken place since the political union with England. Please read. These words here are from a nationalist informing others while writing in an independence blog about the power of Westminster. For emphasis, I will read them out. Yes, a colonial assembly is merely a talking shop to keep the natives occupied with local matters. Real power lies elsewhere. As George Osborne once noted, Scotland is held tight by what he called the arms of the British state, which is the Crown, Police, Civil Service, Prosecution Service and MI5. Recent and ongoing cases illustrate the way the racket works, who is protected and who is prosecuted. As Franz Cannon said, colonialism is force. A co-opted national party became department administrators, handing out the wages of colonialism to the same elites and groups year after year, what Césaire called the watchdogs of colonialism. Colonialism is democracy without power or justice. In 2016 in Canada, a legislator called Jonathan Rudin was talking to a panel of people, and he was talking about the mistreatment of the original Aboriginal Indians and in Canada, which the Canadians call the First Nations. This is what he said on control. Does that ring any bells? That's the end of my video. I mentioned earlier that if you want to really understand what colonisation is in Scotland. As I say, many people don't recognise it. But read this book, Doonharden. Doonharden is Scots and it means held down, in other words, oppressed. If you love Scotland, parts of this book will make you angry. In this series, I've done 3 completed videos. This is the 4th. I have 2 planned, one about the erasure of our Scots and Gaelic language as summarised in this presentation, and my final video in the series is called Fictional Kingdom, Fraudulent State. I hope indeed that this has made you think in this quick 37-minute video. I thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.